Seeing me holding my newborn in worn-out clothes, my grandmother frowned. "Wasn't $300,000 a month enough?" I said. "I never received a single dollar." Then she called her lawyers. She was standing in the hospital doorway with her coat still buttoned, the way she always kept it when she didn't plan on staying long. Her eyes moved over me slowly, the way they moved over everything, cataloging, before feeling. The gray sweatshirt I'd worn for 2 days straight, the hospital bracelet still on my wrist, the bassinet by the window, and the small sleeping weight of my daughter against my chest, one fist tucked under her chin like she was bracing for something even in her sleep. My grandmother wasn't looking at the baby yet. She was looking at me, and there was something in her expression I couldn't place. Not disapproval exactly, not yet, but the particular stillness of someone doing math they didn't expect to have to do. I thought I'd misheard her. My body still felt borrowed, sore in places I hadn't known could be sore, and I hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since Thursday night when the contractions had started coming close enough together that counting them felt like its own kind of labor. The room still smelled like antiseptic and the particular sweetness of a newborn, milk and warmth, and something else I didn't have a word for. There was a bill on the side table, folded face down, because I'd already looked at it twice, and both times my chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with the C-section incision. So when my grandmother said it again, slower this time, like she wanted to watch it land on my face, I just stared back at her, waiting for the sentence to make sense. $300,000 a month, she said, wired to your joint account every first of the month since the wedding. My accountant flagged it during the quarterly review. I assumed you were choosing to live simply. I assumed a great many things, apparently. I looked down at the sweatshirt, at the hospital bag from the discount store, still packed with 2 changes of clothes I'd bought on clearance 8 months ago because the maternity section markdown rack had felt like the responsible choice. At the way I'd slid the billing envelope under a parenting magazine 2 hours earlier so I wouldn't have to look at the number again before I had to. "I never received a single dollar," I said. The room didn't get loud. It got very still, which with my grandmother was always the worst of the two. She didn't raise her voice, didn't ask if I was sure, didn't ask me to explain myself or account for 3 years of silence on a subject I hadn't known existed. She reached into her bag, took out her phone, and said a name into it I didn't recognize, followed by an address and a time, spoken with the same flat efficiency she used for everything that actually mattered to her. Then she hung up and sat down in the chair across from me, coat still buttoned, like she was waiting for a train she already knew was coming. "Who was that?" I asked, because it was the only question my exhausted brain could produce. "My attorney," she said. "The good one, not the one for contracts." I didn't ask what that meant. I found out soon enough. My grandmother had never been a warm woman, not in the way people usually mean it. She didn't hug first or ask about feelings before asking about facts. She'd built Whitmore Holdings from 3 commercial properties into something considerably larger over 4 decades, and she ran her family the same way she ran everything else, with structure, with oversight, with the assumption that people would tell you the truth only as often as you verified it. I used to find that exhausting, growing up. I used to think love, real love, should feel softer than an audit. Sitting in that hospital bed with my daughter asleep on my chest, watching my grandmother sit very still with a fury she hadn't spoken yet, I understood for the first time that her version of love had just moved faster than anyone's grief could. I want to say I felt something dramatic in that moment. Rage, betrayal, the kind of cinematic clarity people describe when they talk about the instant everything changed. Mostly I felt tired and confused and a little embarrassed, like I'd somehow misplaced $300,000 a month without noticing, the way you might misplace your keys. Because here's what I actually knew. For 3 years of marriage, I knew a husband who told me every single quarter without fail that the market was tight and we needed to be careful. I knew a husband who kept his name as the sole signer on our accounts for tax reasons, a phrase he used so often and so smoothly that I'd stopped hearing it as an explanation and started hearing it as simply true, the way you stop noticing a hum in a room after enough time living inside it. I knew a husband who handled the notifications himself, who said he was better at tracking timing and fees, who fixed declined cards at the grocery store or the baby store with one quiet phone call and never once explained what had actually gone wrong. I told myself that was what marriage looked like when one person understood money better than the other. I told myself a lot of things that year. I picked up night shifts at a pharmacy distribution warehouse when I was 7 months pregnant because he'd said we needed to get through the quarter and I didn't know how else to help. I stood under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, scanning shelves of inventory with my feet swollen past the point of comfort, my back aching in a way that made sitting down feel like its own small victory, telling myself this was temporary. This was what sacrifice for a family looked like. I put back the maternity support pillow I'd wanted twice, once in my 2nd trimester and once in my 3rd, because it felt indulgent when we were supposedly stretched thin. I told myself I was being resourceful, not managed. There's a difference, I used to think, though I couldn't have told you what it was if you'd asked me to define it. My grandmother didn't say any of that had been foolish. She never did. Not once. Not that day or any day after. She just asked quietly, sitting across from my hospital bed with her hands folded in her lap, what he'd told me whenever I'd questioned the numbers. "He told me not to worry," I said. "He said he'd handled it. He said I should focus on the baby. That stress wasn't good for either of us. And he was right about that part." So I stopped asking. She nodded once, slowly, like she already knew what the answer was going to be, before the attorney had confirmed a single fact. "That's the tell," she said. "Not the lying. Men lie about money constantly. It's practically a hobby. It's the redirecting. He didn't answer you. He soothed you. There's a difference, and I should have taught you to hear it years ago." I didn't have a response to that. I was still holding my daughter, still feeling the particular ache of a body that had just done something something enormous, and my grandmother was already 3 steps ahead of me in a conversation I hadn't caught up to yet. The attorney arrived at the house that evening, not the hospital. My grandmother had signed the discharge paperwork herself, cutting through 2 days of recommended observation with the particular authority of someone who'd once sat on a hospital board and knew exactly which forms actually mattered. She was 60-something, narrow-framed, with the kind of sharp, assessing eyes that made you feel like you were being cross-examined before you'd said a word. She wore a navy suit that looked like it had never once wrinkled in its life, and she carried a leather folder that was already, unmistakably, 3 inches thick before she'd asked me a single question. She sat at my grandmother's dining table, the same table I'd eaten holiday dinners at as a child, and set the folder down without opening it. "Start at the beginning," she said, "and don't improve it. I don't need the version where you come off well. I need the version that's true." So I did. I told her about the fundraising dinner where I'd met him 3 years before my daughter was born, and how he'd had the exact kind of face that made people call him composed rather than cold. I told her about the joint account, opened 2 months before the wedding, and how the idea had come from him. A household account, he'd said, would simplify everything. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, the eventual baby fund, one system, one dashboard, less to think about. I told her how sensible it had sounded at the time, how I'd actually felt grateful, like I'd married someone who took the boring parts of adulthood seriously so I wouldn't have to. I told her about the narrowing, how notifications had started going to his phone because he was setting up the autopay, how password resets went through his email because he'd built the account interface and it was simpler that way, how large transfers were easier if he handled them because his bank had higher limits and fewer holds, and every single one of these changes had arrived dressed as convenience, as care, as a man protecting his wife from the tedious mechanics of finance so she could focus on more important things. The attorney interrupted me twice while I talked, once to ask exactly when the notifications had stopped coming to my phone. I had to think about it, and landed on some point in the first year, though I couldn't pin an exact month, which she noted with a small frown. Once to ask whether he'd ever explained at the time the account was opened why his name alone appeared as the primary signer when we'd opened it together, as a couple, presumably as equals. I said no. I said it had never occurred to me to ask, because at the time it had felt like a formality, the kind of paperwork detail nobody actually reads. Both times, she wrote something down without looking up, in a small, tight handwriting I couldn't read upside down, like each answer confirmed something she'd already been circling before I'd finished the sentence. Partway through the account of our marriage, she stopped me on something I hadn't thought twice about in 3 years. I'd mentioned, almost as an aside, that he always took a call in the garage on Sunday afternoons, every Sunday, without fail, rain or vacation or holiday, for the entire length of our marriage. I'd assumed it was a client. Sometimes I'd assumed it was his mother, who he described as a lot and preferred to manage in isolation. Sometimes I hadn't thought about it at all, the way you stop noticing a habit once it's calcified into routine. He always came back in afterward looking a little tired, a little relieved, the particular expression of someone who just finished handling something he needed to finish. She wrote that down and circled it twice, hard enough that I could see the indentation from where I sat. "How long?" she asked, not looking up. "Would you say these calls lasted?" 20 minutes, sometimes 30. Every week. Every week. She made another note and moved on, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed. Some almost imperceptible shift from information gathering to something more targeted, like a hunting dog that's caught a scent it isn't ready to announce yet. I told her about the declined cards, the one at the baby store in my 3rd trimester, when I'd been trying to buy a bassinet sheet set, and the card had simply failed. No explanation. And he'd fixed it with a single call from the parking lot while I waited inside, feeling humiliated in a way I couldn't name. I told her about the pharmacy warehouse job, the night shifts, the swollen feet, the maternity pillow I'd put back twice. I told her all of it, in order, the way she'd asked, without trying to make myself sound wise or resilient or anything other than exactly what I'd been, a tired, pregnant woman who had trusted the person she'd married. When I finished, the attorney opened the folder. "Every incoming transfer from your grandmother's holdings," she said, "has been routed out within 72 hours of arrival, sometimes faster, to a secondary account." She slid the first page across the table toward me, a printed statement with dates running down the left margin in a column that seemed to go on longer than I wanted it to. One name on that account, his. For a second, just a second, I felt something that resembled relief, which even in the moment struck me as an absurd thing to feel. At least there was an answer. At least I wasn't losing my mind. Hadn't imagined 3 years of scarcity that had never needed to exist. He'd been keeping it for himself, hoarding it somewhere while I worked night shifts and put back the pillow and told myself we were struggling together, as partners, as a team facing something difficult, side by side. It was ugly, but it made a kind of sense I could hold on to. A story with a shape I recognized from every warning I'd ever half listened to about controlling men and financial abuse. Then my grandmother, who had been sitting silently at the head of the table through all of it, picked up the second page and read the transfer memo line out loud, one word at a time, like she wanted each syllable to land separately. "Spousal support," she said. "Prior marriage." The room went very quiet. "I don't understand," I said, and I genuinely didn't, not for several long seconds. The words were simple enough individually, but arranged together they refused to mean anything I could process. The attorney was the one who said it plainly, because my grandmother had gone still in a way that suggested she needed a moment before she trusted her own voice. "He was married before you," the attorney said. "Before this marriage, there's a divorce decree on file in a different county, dated 4 years before your wedding. Under the terms, he owes monthly spousal support to his first wife, tied to the mortgage on on a property they jointly purchased during that marriage. For the past 3 years, that obligation has been paid, routed, disguised, filed under a household label that gave it cover, using money your grandmother sent for your household. Not his income, not his savings. Money that was functionally supposed to be yours. I sat there doing math I hadn't asked to do. 3 years. 36 months more or less since the wedding. A mortgage I'd never seen, on a house I'd never known existed, in a life I hadn't known preceded mine, paid for with money I'd been told, in 100 small ways over 3 years, simply didn't exist. He mentioned a first marriage once, I said slowly, the memory surfacing like something rising from underwater. Early on, he called it a starter marriage, said it hadn't taken, like it was a job that fell through. I didn't ask more because he clearly didn't want to talk about it, and I thought that was kindness, giving him space. It wasn't kindness, my grandmother said. It was architecture. There's a difference, and I think you're about to learn it very quickly. He called that night twice before I let it go to voicemail. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in my grandmother's house, the same room I'd slept in as a child, with the same water stain on the ceiling, shaped vaguely like a rabbit that I used to trace with my eyes before falling asleep. And I listened to my phone buzz against the nightstand until it stopped, and buzz again, then stop. My daughter was asleep in the bassinet my grandmother had produced from somewhere, an antique thing with a modern mattress, and I found myself watching her breathe instead of answering. The voicemail, when I finally played it, was 4 minutes long. He said there were things I didn't understand about the structure. He said the term itself, structure, more than once, like it was a load-bearing word that could hold up whatever he built on top of it. He said he'd been protecting both households the best way he knew how, that it was complicated, that money moved differently once you understood cycles and timing and exposure. Phrases that had always sounded impressive to me before and now just sounded like a man narrating his own alibi. He said none of it had come from a bad place. He said he loved me. He said he hoped someday I'd understand that context mattered. He never once said the word sorry. He said structure. He said protecting. He used every available word except the one that would have actually meant something. I didn't call him back that night. I let the attorney handle the next contact because by the following morning, she'd already sent a preservation notice to the bank and a formal letter outlining the discovery. And legally, she told me, direct contact between us was no longer advisable until the account freeze was in place. But he showed up anyway 2 days later at my grandmother's front gate because apparently structure didn't extend to respecting a boundary he hadn't personally drawn. I watched from the upstairs window as my grandmother went out to meet him on the front steps rather than let him pass the gate. She didn't invite him in. She stood with her arms folded, coat buttoned even in the mild afternoon, and let him talk for exactly as long as it took her to decide she was done listening. I couldn't hear all of it from where I stood, but I could hear enough. He said my name. He said misunderstanding. He said something about how emotional decisions made during postpartum recovery weren't decisions that should carry legal weight. A sentence that made my grandmother's spine visibly straighten in a way I recognized from childhood, the particular posture she took right before she said something someone would remember for years. She is not confused, my grandmother said, loud enough that I caught every word through the window glass. She is informed. Those are very different conditions, and I'd think a man in your position would want to be careful about which one he's accusing her of. He tried a different approach after that, softer, I think, though I couldn't hear the words, just the register of his voice shifting into something more pleading. My grandmother let him finish. Then she said one sentence that ended the conversation entirely. You had 3 years to tell her the truth voluntarily, she said. You chose 3 years of narrowing her access, monitoring her questions, and calling her tired instead of correct. I am not interested in what you'd like to explain now that a lawyer is reading your bank statements. Get off my property. He left. I watched his car pull away from the window, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet, which was not triumph exactly, but a kind of loosening, like a hand that had been clenched for 3 years slowly starting to open. Following the confrontation I actually needed happened 4 days later, not at the gate, but in a conference room at the attorney's firm, with both our attorneys present and a court reporter transcribing every word, because by then she had filed for emergency account preservation, and a hearing had been set faster than I'd expected, given how my grandmother had described the general pace of family court. He looked smaller in that room than he had at our wedding, smaller than he'd looked across our kitchen table 100 times over 3 years. He wore a suit I recognized, one he usually reserved for closings he considered important, and I understood, watching him settle into the chair across from me, that some part of him still believed this was a meeting he could win with the right posture. I want to be clear, his attorney began, that my client disputes any characterization of these transfers as concealment. There were legitimate legal obligations. He told her the money didn't exist, the attorney said, cutting in without raising her voice, which I was learning was how she did everything that mattered. Not that it existed and was allocated elsewhere, that it didn't exist. That's not a dispute about characterization. That's a dispute about whether my client's granddaughter was lied to for 3 years, and the bank records answer that question without needing your help. His attorney started to respond. He put a hand on her arm, and she stopped, which told me something about who was actually running this particular defense. I never said it didn't exist, he said, looking at me directly for the first time since I'd sat down. I said we needed to be careful. Those aren't the same thing. You let me work a warehouse job at 7 months pregnant, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. You let me put back a support pillow twice because you said we were tight. You knew every single time I said that word, tight, that there was $300,000 a month sitting somewhere I couldn't see, and you let me believe I was the unreasonable one for asking where it went. I was protecting the marriage, he said. If you'd known about the support obligation from before we met, you would have I would have what? I said. Been honest with instead of managed? You don't get to decide what I would have done with information you never gave me the chance to have. He didn't have an answer to that. For the first time since I'd known him, I watched him run out of language, the smooth vocabulary that had always been his primary tool simply failing to produce anything useful in the moment he needed it most. There's something else, the attorney said into the silence, and I watched her slide a single page across the table, not to me, but to his attorney. Financial records also show a secondary card authorized under your client's brokerage account, with charges dating back roughly 18 months. Hotels, retail, a jewelry purchase in March of last year. Authorized user's name on the card is not my client's granddaughter. I watched his face change. It wasn't guilt exactly, or not only guilt. It was the particular expression of a man watching a second lie surface before he'd finished managing the first one, calculating in real time how much worse this made everything, how much less room he now had to maneuver. Whose name? I asked, though some part of me had already guessed. The way you sometimes know an answer half a second before you're told it, your body arriving at the truth just ahead of your mind. We'll get to that, the attorney said, and closed the folder, which was somehow worse than if she'd simply told me. The answer came 2 weeks later, not from the attorney directly, but from a forensic accountant she'd brought in to trace the brokerage account in full, a quiet, precise accountant who spoke almost entirely in numbers and dates, and seemed personally offended by inconsistent record-keeping in a way that made him extremely good at his job. We met at the attorney's office on a Tuesday, my grandmother beside me, my daughter home with a sitter for the first time since the hospital, which felt like its own small, strange milestone I didn't have room to process yet. He laid out a timeline on the conference table, printed on oversized paper, dates running left to right with small annotations beneath each entry. The secondary card, he said, was opened 4 months before your wedding. Authorized user added at that time and never removed. Charges are consistent and ongoing. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger fraud flags on its own. Restaurant charges. A recurring monthly charge to a nail salon in a town about 40 minutes from where you live. 2 hotel stays per year. Always the same weekend in October. Always the same property. Whose name? I asked again. And this time he answered directly, because unlike the attorney, subtlety wasn't really his instrument. His first wife, he said. Cross-referencing court filings, that's the name on the original divorce decree. I sat with that for longer than I meant to. Not shock exactly. I think some part of me had already assembled the shape of it in the conference room 2 weeks earlier, watching his face when the attorney mentioned the card. But hearing it stated plainly was different from suspecting it privately, the way a diagnosis lands differently than a set of symptoms you'd already half-diagnosed yourself. He was still seeing her, I said, not a question. I can't speak to the nature of the relationship, he said, with the careful precision of someone who dealt exclusively in what could be proven. I can tell you the financial pattern is consistent with ongoing regular contact spanning the entire length of your marriage. The October hotel stays predate your wedding by at least 6 years, based on a separate reservation history we were able to pull. They didn't stop when he married you. They simply continued, funded by an account your grandmother's transfers were feeding. My grandmother beside me had gone very quiet, which by now I understood as her most dangerous register. So he didn't just fail to tell her about a support obligation, she said slowly, like she was building the sentence one careful piece at a time. He maintained a second relationship, funded by money intended for her household, for the entire duration of the marriage. That's what the records support, he said. I thought about the Sunday garage calls, 30 minutes every week without fail for 3 years. I thought about how he'd always come back in looking tired and relieved, like he'd finished something necessary. I'd assumed, when I'd assumed anything at all, that it was work, or his difficult mother, or nothing worth asking about. It had never once occurred to me that the person on the other end of those calls might have a name, a mortgage, an October reservation, at the same hotel year after year. I need a minute, I said, and stood up and walked to the window of the attorney's office, which looked out over a parking lot that suddenly seemed like the only honest thing in the room. Gray, plain, exactly what it appeared to be. My grandmother came and stood beside me after a moment, not saying anything at first, which from her was its own form of comfort. I keep waiting to feel something bigger, I said eventually. Betrayed, or humiliated, or something with a real name. Mostly I just feel stupid. 3 years of Sunday phone calls, and I never once wondered. You weren't stupid, my grandmother said. You were married to someone who'd spent years learning exactly how much attention a lie could survive if it was delivered calmly enough. That's not a flaw in you. That's a skill in him, and not a rare one. I've watched it work on smarter women than either of us. Did you know? I asked. About any of it before this? No, she said, and something in her voice made it clear this admission cost her something. I trusted your judgment about your own marriage, which I now understand was a mistake, not because your judgment was poor, but because I gave you no tools to verify what you were being told. I handed you money and assumed the marriage around it was sound architecture. I never checked the foundation. That's mine to carry, not yours. We stood at the window a while longer, watching cars come and go in a parking lot that had nothing to do with any of this. And for the first time since the hospital doorway, I let myself cry, not from grief exactly, but from something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally being handed a complete picture, however ugly, after 3 years of only ever being given fragments designed to keep me calm. The attorney amended the filing that afternoon. What had started as a financial fraud and misappropriation claim now included allegations of concealed marital assets used to fund an ongoing extramarital relationship, which she explained in her flat, efficient way, would matter considerably in the divorce proceedings that were now obviously inevitable, and would matter even more in the custody framework should he attempt to contest it. Judges care about a lot of things, she said, closing her laptop after drafting the amendment. But financial concealment concealment used to fund infidelity at the direct expense of a pregnant spouse's basic needs is not a detail that reads well in front of a family court judge. It reads like exactly what it is. I asked her, before she left that evening, what happened next, not legally. I understood the legal mechanics well enough by then, the preservation orders and disclosures, and the slow, grinding machinery of discovery. I meant the rest of it. The version of my life that existed after this, the one I hadn't had time to imagine yet because I'd been too busy surviving the version that had just ended. That part, the attorney said, gathering her folder, isn't really a legal question. That one's yours. The consequences, once they started, moved faster than I expected, and in directions I hadn't anticipated. I'd assumed, if I'd thought about it at all, that this would stay contained to courtrooms and filings and the particular grinding privacy of a divorce proceeding. I hadn't accounted for the fact that he worked in an industry where reputation functioned as currency in its own right, separate from and sometimes more valuable than actual money. He worked in private capital advisory, the kind of role that ran on relationships, on trust extended by people who had a great deal to lose if that trust turned out to be misplaced. 2 weeks after the amended filing, a firm he'd been courting for a significant advisory contract quietly paused negotiations, citing, in the careful language firms use when they mean something they won't say directly, an ongoing personal matter requiring resolution before proceeding. I only learned this because the attorney heard it secondhand through the kind of professional grapevine that exists in every industry, the one that moves information faster than any official channel ever could. 3 weeks after that, a colleague of his, someone I'd met exactly twice at dinners I could barely remember now, faces blurred by how careful I'd had to be during that whole period about which version of myself I was performing, reached out to the attorney's office directly, not to me, to her, offering, unprompted, a sworn statement describing a conversation in which he'd allegedly referred to his financial arrangement as keeping the household separated cleanly, a phrase that, once submitted as evidence, did considerable damage to the confused, well-intentioned husband narrative his attorney had been quietly trying to construct. I want to say I felt triumphant, watching each piece land. Mostly I felt tired in a different way than the hospital tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from finally not having to manage anyone's feelings but my own and my daughter's, and discovering how much energy that alone required, now that I noticed its absence. He tried once to reach me directly instead of through counsel, a text message late on a Tuesday that read only, "I know you're angry. I'd do anything to fix this. Please just talk to me." I looked at it for a long time before I understood what bothered me most about it. Not the plea itself, which was almost expected by then. It was the word fix, arriving again. The same instinct that had built 3 years of careful, calm management now aimed at the wreckage of what that management had produced, as though the marriage were still a system that could be optimized, rather than a trust that had already irreversibly broken. I didn't respond. The attorney had advised against it weeks earlier, and by then I'd stopped needing the advice repeated. Some boundaries you hold because someone tells you to, others you hold because you finally understood, on your own, exactly what crossing them cost you the first time. The hearing, when it came, was shorter than I'd braced for. His defense had, by then, shifted almost entirely from denial to damage control, which my grandmother's attorney had predicted weeks earlier, with a kind of weary precision that suggested she'd watched this particular collapse pattern many times before. The judge reviewed the financial records, the concealment timeline, the pattern of transfers routed within 72 hours of arrival, and the secondary card charges spanning the length of the marriage, and granted the emergency relief she had requested: full account freeze, temporary full custody pending the broader proceeding, and a preservation order covering every financial record either party had access to. He didn't look at me on the way out of the courtroom. I noticed that more than I expected to. 3 years of a man who'd always found a way to hold my gaze, even during arguments, even during the worst of the declined card conversations, and in the one moment that actually mattered, he looked at the floor instead. My grandmother didn't say anything as we walked out together, my daughter asleep against my chest in the same position she'd held that first day in the hospital, one fist tucked under her chin. It wasn't until we were in the car, pulling out of the courthouse lot, that she finally spoke. "I should have structured the transfers differently from the beginning," she said, watching the courthouse recede in the side mirror. "Direct accounts, protected trusts, hard walls a husband couldn't quietly reroute in the space of 72 hours. I gave you a cushion when I should have given you architecture, and the difference cost you 3 years you didn't need to lose." "You didn't know," I said. "I didn't check," she said. "Those aren't the same failure, but they land in roughly the same place." We drove in silence for a while after that, past the pharmacy warehouse where I'd worked night shifts 8 months pregnant, past the baby store where a card had once declined for reasons I'd never been allowed to understand, past all the small landmarks of a life I'd been quietly, carefully managed through without ever fully realizing the shape of the cage until someone else had pointed at the bars. He called that night, one last time before the attorney's final letter formally closed direct contact between us for the duration of the proceeding. I let it go to voicemail the way I had every time since the hospital, and I listened to it once, standing in the kitchen of my grandmother's house while my daughter slept upstairs in the room that used to be mine. He talked about structure again, about protecting both households the best way he knew how, about context and complexity, and how none of it had come from a bad place. The same words arranged in a slightly different order, like he had a limited vocabulary for remorse and kept reaching for the same few tools because he genuinely didn't have others. He never once said the word sorry. I saved the voicemail. Not for me. I didn't need it. Not anymore. Not in the way I once thought I might, as evidence or ammunition or proof I hadn't hadn't imagined any of it. I saved it for the day my daughter is old enough to ask what kind of man wired his new wife's grocery money into a mortgage and a second relationship he never once mentioned, and called it protection right up until the moment someone finally made him stop. I think someday she'll want to know exactly what he sounded like saying it.